Welcome, guys, to the Muscle by Brain podcast with JPS and Lifting for Life. I'm your host, Jacob Skepis, and we have Ian McCarthy on the line. Ian, how are you, man?
Doing really well. How are you?
I'm very well. And guys, this is your weekly podcast for everything evidence-based, even though we haven't been doing it weekly for various reasons. And we are bringing you everything evidence-based as it relates to lifting, physique, and bodybuilding. And on today's episode, we're going to be discussing periodization in the context of bodybuilding. And we're going to talk about how to plan training for long-term muscle growth in both the off-season as well as during the contest prep, and talk a little bit about what is often misinterpreted theory when it comes to periodization, and endeavor to help you guys understand this concept as well as give you some practical takeaways that you can apply to your training. So welcome, Ian. I'm excited to talk about this one.
Yeah, me too. I had forgotten that was the topic. I was going to ask if we had one, but I'm down to improvise. I tend to thrive in that context.
Awesome. And I guess the first thing we need to discuss is that periodization as a theory is just organizing training long term to manage fatigue and then peak performance at competition. And it's been shown in the literature to be more effective than non-periodized training. However, in my opinion, the research on periodization is quite limited in scope, especially when it comes to hypertrophy training, which makes applying the theory quite difficult. So, Ian, do you want to talk about some basic definitions of periodization, and then we'll give it some context from there?
Yes, I'm slightly distracted as I'm pulling up the title of a review, a periodization review I just read, which is highly relevant to this in terms of the limitations of periodization research. So yes, I think confusion can arise as a result of people talking about different things and using the same term. I do tend to agree with Eric Helms in going for a simplified or a simpler or a simple concept of periodization, which would simply say the non-random or structured variation in training variables. So and this actually, I'll just get right into some of the issues of periodization research because it's relevant to this question. The research as a whole seems to treat variation and periodization as being the same thing, but variation is not necessarily periodized or periodization. I mean, if you just do things differently all the time, that would count as variation. So muscle confusion type training. But that wouldn't count as periodization because it lacks the organization or structured aspect of it, which differentiates periodization. So I think without having further worked this out, I would say that in my mind, periodization has two components: variation and organization. So in other words, if something were organized but not varied, that would be non-periodized. And if it were varied but not organized, that would also be non-periodized.
Yep.
So I think that's the starting point. And then from there, we can then ask, is this superior? What should it look like? And so on.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. I like Eric's simplification of the theory, and he quotes Buford in the video he did on periodization in mass, if you guys haven't checked it out, and he simply defined it as planned manipulation of training variables to maximize outcomes, which I think is important. And obviously how we apply this in the context of hypertrophy is very different to how strength and conditioning coaches apply it for strength and performance-based athletes, which I think is a lot of the confusion that's brought across into the bodybuilding world. Is people apply the concept, as you mentioned, in a very different context to what it's intended for. So do bodybuilders need to plan their training in the same way that powerlifters, Olympic lifters, and other athletes need to?
No, and if you give me 10 seconds, I can improve the audio on my end. Just a second.
All good.
I have this air purifier and I have realized that video, anything recorded in this room sounds better with it off. So the answer is no, in the sense that the desired outcome is different. I mean, if you were to be really charitable, you could say it's fundamentally the same because the intent is to generate this outcome, but I'm not sure that's particularly helpful. I would say no. I would say if typically people desire to maximize whatever the outcome is they want, so maximum hypertrophy, maximum strength, and I do think that maximizing strength does entail a maximization of muscle mass, at least to the in terms of the muscles which contribute to the relevant exercises. But I don't think that maximizing hypertrophy entails maximizing strength. So no, and I think to make this very practical, I think that one can maximize hypertrophy with tremendously, well, that might be an overstatement, significantly less complex periodization relative to true strength training in the sense of with the intention being to improve strength. For example, I genuinely think you can maximize hypertrophy completely abandoning or not using the volume intensification peaking block model.
Yeah.
Like never use it. I think you could use that, and I wouldn't want to say that you can't maximize hypertrophy doing that. I think that the person who makes the claim that you cannot do this and get the best results, I think that you have to be able to give good arguments for that. But similarly, the person who says you have to do this in order to make the best muscle gain progress, given hypertrophy is kind of oddly simple. Now, if you want to talk about it in terms of hypertrophic mechanisms, it's more complex than, honestly, probably practically anyone understands in a good way.
Definitely.
But that's not really the level of understanding which is of greatest practical significance. In practice, it's a lot of train each muscle group with at least moderately high volume, training everything at least twice a week and so on. And I think that you can check all those boxes and then you find, wait, this isn't periodized, or this isn't, and this outside of maybe a training week, or, I could see, honestly, I do think that you could even restrict it to, this is what I do in a training week, and then make sure that is designed in a manner that you're able to make adjustments.
Yeah, for sure. And there are obviously a number of different models to periodize and plan training, such as block periodization, conjugate, concurrent, linear, daily undulating periodization. And all of these models, in essence, are linear. Which model do you feel lends itself best to hypertrophy, and why?
Daily undulating periodization, in that it works within the training week, and I found that in the past, so if we were to go back, let's say 5 years, it's tough to remember this is what my training was in August 2013 off the top of your head, but there was a point at which I didn't really even vary things like load, rep ranges, from one workout to the next. And when I say that, I'm referring to the same workout, not Monday to Tuesday, but Monday to a Monday, or day one to day one. And I do think that I've benefited a lot from being much more attentive to that. Things like, I think I've gotten a huge amount of mileage out of the very simple structure of heavy days in the beginning of the week and then lighter days immediately following. So you still get hypertrophic stimulus, but you're able to recover, as opposed to heavy workouts, run yourself into the ground in the middle of the week, and then you're dead at the tail end of a training week. So yeah, that's if that's what we mean by periodization, then I'm a huge advocate of that. Again, a skeptic in the sense of longer time periods. Really, the longer the period, the more I'm going to ask the question of, um, why do that, or why would you think that that would be better, as opposed to, and typically what you see is very significant fluctuations in things like training volume over longer periods, and I remain unconvinced that that is superior in the long term to more of progression occurs, but instead of seeing aggressive increases in volume and then aggressive deloads, things like this, if you look at it long term, the line's actually similar, but instead of seeing this and then a drop, you see slower and more sustained progression. So I don't remember I remember what the question is. I think I answered it.
Yeah, you did answer it. And yeah, I would tend to agree. One of the criticisms of block periodization is that you miss out at certain phases of adequate volume because it is so linear in nature. And this is where daily undulating periodization can really pick up the slack, I guess, and ensure that volume is appropriate throughout every single mesocycle, as opposed to having periods at extremely low volumes. And something that is also important, I feel, when we talk about periodization is that having different training days within a week seems to be more important for hypertrophy. So the way that we plan or organize our microcycle, as opposed to planning mesocycle after mesocycle and a macrocycle for athletic development. Do you want to discuss in further detail why you feel that a microcycle is where we just need to focus our attention and then progress from there?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure how best to phrase this, but what's coming to mind is, if I, from a I understand from the perspective of desiring to, maximize strength. As an example, you don't want to be, and this quickly gets into an area where I'm relatively unfamiliar, but you wouldn't want to perpetually train with high volumes because that would be insufficiently specific, as an example.
Correct.
And you also wouldn't want to just perpetually train at very high intensities for sake of injury risk, fatigue. Your overall volume is going to be lower, and so on. So I take from that the elements that I think are applicable to hypertrophy training. So again, if I think that it probably makes sense to train in a wide variety of rep ranges, I think that you have to be cognizant of, okay, how much can you do this? What is the injury risk? How locally and centrally fatiguing is it? And so on. And I do think that, really pushing hard on a Monday can have implications in terms of what you're going to do on a Wednesday. But I think from a hypertrophic perspective, again, the longer the time period, the more unconvinced I get. And if someone were to say, what it is you did 4 weeks ago on this day should have, you should be able to draw a line between that and this somehow, in terms of, again, I think progression should be happening. I mean, that, some things should be improved over time. Not saying that that isn't the case, but in terms of, I deliberately held back on volume very aggressively there so that I could make it here, but then I know that I can't maintain the level of volume I'm doing now, so over here I'm going to have to decrease volume. I just find it needlessly complex. I find that it's self-sustaining, but not in a good way. You'll have a ramp up of volume, but then you can't sustain that, so you have to pull back. But then pulling back, that isn't a level of volume that will allow you to improve, and so on. And it feels like, I don't want to speak too disparagingly or, just make it sound, just deflate this to making it sound like total nonsense. But again, I just find it, funnily enough, I'm realizing people have for years accused me of overcomplication of hypertrophy training and so on. And I find that complex periodization schemes in the context of the goal is gaining muscle, maximizing muscle mass, to be an overcomplication, because it is additionally complicated. And I remain, again, I've said it repeatedly, remain unconvinced that it's additionally effective. And that's what would need to be true in order for it to be justified in doing that. So I'm much more in the vein of, get a sense of what someone can tolerate, both within a day, over a 3-day period, a training week, kind of get a rough average, right? And then, yes, you can implement things like daily undulating periodization. Maybe here you're going to push a little bit harder in this way. Over here, you still want to get your appropriate frequency. So you're going to do that with different exercises and higher rep ranges, so you can still do it. You can still recover in all of this. But yeah, I have not found it. To put it another way, I haven't found myself in a situation where I'm like, this fundamentally isn't working. I need to think longer term. I would note, though, that when I write progression schemes, I do think long term.
Yeah.
But so, I might even look at something and say, if someone keeps this up, okay, in 6 weeks it's very sustainable, but man, over 6 months they really can't do this. So maybe it should be a little more conservative and so on.
Yeah.
I think about that, but I think that's different to a lot of these periodization models.
You brought up a lot of really important concepts within periodization that we're going to address today. But before we do so, I thought it'd be really interesting to use myself as a bit of an example in this, because obviously you've been programming for me, with what you've been discussing, and for the last 12 weeks. And prior to that, I was incorporating a very different periodization model for, the better part of 12 months. I was having a 5 up, 1 down approach where I would, progressively overload for 5 weeks, reduce volume and so on and so forth. However, the last 12 weeks, it's been, you've set out my microcycle, and then it's been progressively overloading from there with different progression models that you've applied. And I would say that over the last 12 weeks, I haven't yet stalled out, which I'm, late intermediate, borderline advanced trainee, and I'm still seeing some great progression, and it's been 12 weeks. Like, I haven't had to pull back or deload or anything like that, and I think it's a useful, point for listeners to take away, is that there's many ways to skin a cat, but in the context of bodybuilding, we're not performance athletes. And I think, I was probably, I wouldn't say under the misconception that I was a performance athlete, but misapplying the, concepts and theory of periodization. And I thought that was really interesting, looking back on that.
Oh, absolutely. I think that it can be easier to misjudge things when they aren't dichotomous. And let me clarify what I mean in this context. If it were literally, you either train for strength and you gain strength, or you train for hypertrophy and you gain no strength and you don't need to progressively overload, if it were like that, no gray area, then I feel, as long as someone understood that, to a large extent, they would be good to go. But there is this relationship. Admittedly, Jeremy Lenicky and perhaps his colleagues are actually, there are others on those papers, are skeptical of the relationship between muscle cross-section, muscle size and strength, but that's a minority view, and I don't agree with that. I think that there probably is, a relationship between these. Muscles getting bigger, everything else remaining the same is going to result in you being stronger, and so on. So it gets harder to judge. Are you skewing too? You can skew too far in the direction of increasing external load, and I do see, my perception is that a lot of people are ending up in that direction as a result of the increased popularity of powerlifting, which can, by the way, that can be good and bad. If someone's 100%. Never progressively overloaded, they're a bodybuilder, And they're like, oh, these powerlifter dudes, they progressive overload. That can be beneficial. At the same time, if someone just goes in the direction of mind muscle connection, it doesn't mean anything.
No
Just
program.
use as much weight as possible
Yeah.
and so on. I think that's not ideal. So yeah, I think that's helpful. And in my own case, there are progression schemes that I set up long ago enough that I don't remember when, and I'm able to sustain them. I think that a large part of it in practice comes down to, 50% of it is pushing yourself and 50% is not, in the sense of you do want to push to progress, but, yes, you will deliberately leave reps on the table because you want to, be able to perform those reps down the road, as opposed to operating at your maximum capacity. And, by the way, I get that this is accounted for in other progression schemes. So this is kind of getting into the question of, training to failure and so on. But yeah, designing progression schemes in a manner that allows for them being sustained indefinitely.
For sure. And the concepts that I think we need to look at, and before we go further into the different types of overload and progression schemes, because I want to get some of your thoughts on that. Obviously, specificity when we design the initial program, and then planning it long term from there. So, how does an athlete or a bodybuilder ensure that they're training specific to building size? Obviously, do you just want to quickly touch on the key things that they need to have in place within a daily undulating periodized model?
Right. I do think that the biggest variables are going to be overall training volume and frequency. So, and by the way, I conceive of training volume in terms of number of working sets. I do find that to be the least bad model. As I've discussed to some extent on social media, I'm writing a book about all of this, and one of the things that I need to edit it, but it's pretty much finished, is this extensive discussion of every definition of volume I know, and strengths and weaknesses, and when I use them and don't, and so on. So volume in terms of number of working sets, I think that's something to consider both with individual workouts and in a training week. And then training frequency in the sense of, given the same volume, you'll make better progress with higher frequency at least twice a week relative to one, and then the research gets tremendously less robust. In terms of, it really varies in terms of how I vary things throughout a training week, but I do frequently use the model of heavy days, light days, moderate days, in that order, where it so depends. I generally regard the heavy workouts as the harder ones. I do find that they are more fatiguing, following the workouts. But if someone really struggles with high rep stuff, then they might actually find those lighter weight workouts really difficult. Similarly, doing a lot of sets of 10 can actually be tough, which would be in between the two. But yeah, that model I use frequently. That's closer to something that I'm comfortable, as a general recommendation, 3 days a week, upper lowers for people who are able to train that much, and then meaning 6 sessions and hitting every body part 3 times a week, and then using the model of heavy, light, upper rep ranges being something like probably 4 at the lowest, and sets of 4 to 6 would be in that heavier workout. What I've typically done, I've refined this more recently, is nothing below 10, typically in a light session, a lot of 12s and 15s, although even that I've pulled back on because a set of 10 can be, or doing sets of 10 can be as effective as sets of 15, but it will be less painful, interestingly. That was a conclusion of, not that direct conclusion, but the Schoenfeld 2016, where they had genuinely light, like sets of 30 versus moderate loading. Hypertrophy was similar, but the training was much less literally
Fatiguing.
much less painful,
Mm.
with heavier loads, in fact. And then the moderate session, so the tail end of the week, a lot of sets of 8, 10, 12. Those are the workouts that probably look most like what bodybuilders typically do.
Yep. And that's something that I see to be most in line with what the research says, as well as what is practically plausible in the gym, because obviously we need to structure things in a manner that sets us up for future progressions long term. And if you're doing the same thing in every workout, it's very easy to become stagnant. And in terms of progressive overload, adding sets, reps, load, increasing frequency, range of motion, there's so many ways that we can overload. What do you see to be the best way, or the most ideal way, I guess, for bodybuilders to progress their training?
Yeah, I think I like to vary as many things as you can keep a hold on.
Mm.
Meaning, if you vary load and number of reps per set and number of sets and tempo and four other things, on a consistent basis, I don't know how one could organize that in a manner which would not become just chaotic and you can't really tell what's going on. I like It depends on the exercise. I have grown to really like triple progression, which is to say that you vary on any one exercise, you will vary number of sets over time, you'll vary load over time, and you'll vary number of reps per set over time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I had this, not really an epiphany, but that's the word that comes to mind. I was writing out a progression scheme about 2 months ago, and it struck me that over an 8-week period, and this was triple progression, it was like 2 or 3 sets. I don't recall the exact rep range, but over a period of 8 weeks, training volume in that case, in terms of volume load, so reps, sets, load, doubled, but the
Mm.
load didn't change. And
Right.
that's a huge
Mm.
advantage of progression schemes, which don't fundamentally rely on increasing load, because past the beginner, low, intermediate stage, it becomes so much more difficult to do that. So yeah, triple progression for a lot of movements, where you might have someone do 2 sets of 8, and then the next set or the next week 3 sets of 8. So they don't even need to do more reps per set.
Mm.
And they're typically able to do that. And you have to calibrate all of this. For example, I found that I can't really do triple progression on leg press, because if I do 2 sets of 10 that are pretty difficult, adding another set is actually really tough.
Mm-hmm.
So for a lot of the hierarchy I use for exercises is not main exercises and accessories. I actually talk about primary, secondary, tertiary. This is another thing that I'm going into extreme detail in the book, of talking about what that even means, which exercises fit in which categories, and so
Mm-hmm.
on. And typically what I do is triple progression is more likely with primary exercises. Let's say a barbell squat. Now, double progression, meaning you vary number of reps per set, and then when you get to a top of a rep range, you increase load, but the number of sets remains the
Mm.
same. That I'm more likely to use on secondary exercises, let's say an incline dumbbell press. And then for tertiary exercises, a lot of isolation stuff, oftentimes I won't even write progression schemes, because you can't sustain them, or form will break down, because people are,
Mm.
you'll be doing a single arm something or other, and you're trying, like, I have to add a rep, but sometimes
Mm-hmm.
you just can't do that. So I'll recommend things like add reps and or weight when possible, while still
Mm.
using good form and still being at the desired RPE.
Definitely, and that's something that I think is very contrasting to what we see in other periodization models for different sports. It's very conservative in that sense, because obviously we're doing a lot more volume as bodybuilders than what you know powerlifters or athletes who have a sport separate to their training are performing. And I guess this is why we can have a less aggressive overloading scheme over time, whereas they are pretty limited in how they can apply overload, thus requiring these different phases of their training, such as deloads and different blocks having different goals and so forth. And I guess an important concept within this, once we're overloading and applying overload, is deloads and maximizing recovery to the adaptation process. So we've spoken about this before, but what is often cited in the literature for periodization is balancing the work to rest ratio so that performance can improve over time. So in the context of bodybuilding, how does this fit within long-term planning?
Absolutely. So I'm realizing that I might be somewhat philosophically opposed to deloads, which that's reflective of me. That doesn't mean the science says deloads are bad, but I think, I'm getting this sense, and I'm not sure I've really thought about this prior to this discussion, but I'm a big fan of being proactive. And now, in the case of something like, someone is trying to increase their 1 rep max on a squat, and by the way, they already squat 800 pounds. I understand how are you going to do that and not accumulate fatigue? Just if someone's able to do that without accumulating fatigue, I would be really curious to see that. I mean, everyone would. However, in the case of hypertrophy training, again, I don't like the idea of designing training in a way where that if you keep doing it, you can't recover. And so that you're going to accumulate fatigue in a way that you can't dissipate without stopping training for some period of time or very aggressively pulling back. So I'm more in the camp of again, wanting to, you need to figure out where someone is. So if someone's able to do 20 really good sets for every single body part every single week forever, I'm not going to tell them, okay, do 8 sets a week because of recovery. We don't want to overtrain you, or we don't want to overreach or something. That wouldn't make any sense because it isn't appropriate to the individual. But similarly, if someone finds that they're really able to do 6 good sets per body part really good sets for each body part in a training week, and if they go 8 sets per body part, they can do it for a little while, but then they can't, I would probably land on, all right, do 6, as opposed to do 8 for a while, but then you can't. So then you have to decrease loads by 30% in deload or whatever it might be. So yeah, I think and all of that is not to say if you need a deload, don't deload because Ian McCarthy doesn't like deloads. That's not my intention. And, certainly if it's apparent, I try to, I have enough training experience where I can sense that I'm doing too much as I'm doing it. And I try to recognize that and go, okay, I need to make an adjustment now as opposed to keep doing this and then maybe down the road I can deal with it. So, gosh, where was I going with that thought? So yeah, again, I try to be proactive. I try not to, in the case of training for hypertrophy, I try not to put people in a position where they're going to need it. But if they do, then you need to respond appropriately. So that, in some cases, I've recommended 10% reactive deloads, which that is not a deload in the sense that most people mean. I completely recognize that. But that's, someone's just they'll have a whole training week is just kind of weird and exercises are feeling too heavy. But if I don't read that as they need an aggressive deload, I might say, okay, let's reset a little bit. My form is getting a little bit sloppy over here. Okay, reduce load by 10%, things like that. And there are cases where, okay, it's, this person has had 6 out of 10 workouts in a row. So we need to do something more aggressive. But again, the ideal for me is, get someone in the gym as much as they can do with their schedule and so on, progressing consistently, but at a modest rate, and in a manner where, yes, some workouts will be harder. Some days they'll need more sleep to recover from their workouts and so on. Some days they'll really feel the previous workout, but by the end of the training week, they're good to go for another training week. As opposed, if someone's getting to the end of the training week and it's like, I feel bad, I would rather just say, okay, this whole approach fundamentally isn't working.
Get it set right at the start.
Right. And I mean, again, it requires trial and error, but I do feel like there's a difference in the objective is the same in the sense that, like, someone who writes more aggressive progression might, intend for someone to be recovered over a 12-week period. Like they'll be more aggressive, but then they'll deload. But I think of that on a smaller scale.
Mm-hmm. And I guess my general thoughts on deloads for hypertrophy, and this is something I've only started to realize, I guess, in the last probably 6 to 12 months, is that if you follow a work to rest ratio that's recommended in strength and conditioning literature of, like, say 3-to-1 work to rest, you're spending 25% of the year with bugger all volume, really, which is counterintuitive. You're resting for a quarter of the year.
Yeah. I mean, interesting, for the sake of presenting a complete picture, there is research. I almost invariably do not remember the names of authors of studies I read, but there's a study in which subjects, two groups of subjects, and some of them trained continuously, and some trained intermittently. It was something like 6 weeks on, 3 weeks off, and the hypertrophic results were comparable. So, I mean, I think it's more complex than this person spends 25% of their time resting and this person doesn't rest in that period. So the difference in hypertrophy is like literally the difference in time spent training. So it wouldn't be this person makes 75% of the gains because 25% of the time is resting, because there's going to be some the speed of gains following that period it's going to be greater. Now Eric has noted that what they were, if I recall correctly, the subjects were regaining muscle they already had. So there's some caveat there that I'm not recalling exactly, but so I would not go as far as to say, okay, the person who, let's say, trained 6 weeks and then doesn't train for 3 is in an ideal position. But again, I wanted to note the caveat of, I would not go as, it's one thing to say you're unconvinced that more aggressive increases in volume and then radical decreases in them is superior. It's another thing to say, hey, you're going to make worse gains because, hey, you're deloading and you're not going to make any gains there.
Definitely, and that's the view that I've had, is that they both have their place, but it's just questioned whether or not taking those aggressive deloads is going to be beneficial, and arguably it's not when we look at things. And I guess this brings into play another concept that's important for training and the way that we progress things and adjust things is autoregulation. So do you want to talk about how autoregulation within periodization and some of the structures and concepts that we've discussed will apply for hypertrophy?
Yeah, I think, again, in discussing true or pure strength training, we quickly get into territory with which I'm less familiar, but my sense is that given hypertrophy to a large extent can be reduced to, okay, you want this muscle to be larger, what is its function? Find exercises which correspond to those joint actions, use a 4-range of motion, appropriate volume on a per session basis and weekly and so on. I mean, certainly you do have to think about things like when you add together all of the volume you're doing for all of these body parts, are you able to recover from all of that cumulatively? However, I think I don't see any good reason to not alter your training on the fly if your best judgment is that it isn't working. If you are generally objective in your judgment. And that's tough, because basically what I'm saying is, if your own judgment of your training while you're in the trenches is generally good, great, you can go with that. Now, if you have someone who, I might be using this term incorrectly in this context, but the word that comes to mind is neurotic. In other words, if you have someone who questions everything to an extreme degree, and they commit to something, but that almost invariably they like find a way to convince themselves basically that it's actually not the right thing to do, and so on. That would be someone who, coming at it purely from the perspective of their psychology, it would be advantageous to say, this is your program, go do this. Well, what do you think? No, this is your program. Now, I'm not saying, they do a squat and their knees are in excruciating pain, you tell them just do it anyway. I am not saying that. But I'm saying the person who's like, I want to do like squats, but then next week I want to do front squats, but then next week I want to do hack squats because I saw this thing online because this person made a video. So that kind of person, I think it can be additionally beneficial to them to have structure. But again, assuming a certain minimum level of someone isn't just capricious, they're not going to change it really kind of arbitrarily. Yeah, if you if you lay things out, okay, this is what I'm going to do this week, and let's say you have 4 training days, and the first workout goes really well, the second you're just dead tired, the third you're dead tired. Okay, I can see changing something, and the fact that you've said this is what I'm going to do. You consider that is relevant. It's a piece of data, but I wouldn't say, okay, this clearly isn't working, but hey, structure, like I want to stick to the plan, so I'm going to stick to something which isn't working. And so, yeah, I do, in my own training, I would say that 70 to 80% of it is consistent, but then I'm quite willing to move things around. And I also think another way to think about it is in terms of, Eric would talk about it in terms of the pyramid. I might use the word hierarchy. Just think about that which is more important and that which is less important. So something like, I am more rigid with my squatting in the week in terms of where it is, how many sets, how I'm progressing, because that's right up there in terms of priority. And there's also, in my mind, there's more room to mess up, in the sense that, if I were to go way too hard here, then that might actually put me in a bad position for the next week, and so on. Whereas something like arms isolation, I might even do a totally different exercise, because because in that case I would actually put this is what I want to do over the maybe slight advantage, but honestly probably not even really there, of doing the exact same biceps isolation.
Yeah, definitely. I guess when we auto-regulate training, there needs to be a minimum threshold to which you're actually adhering to the plan, because otherwise if you're just adjusting things for the sake of it, then you're not following the plan at all. You're just deviating, creating a totally new plan.
I completely agree. Yeah, I mean, for me, it might be, I think there was one day this week where I did one extra set of squats because I knew I could do it. Like I really wanted to do it kind of in principle of like, all right, I did it, and did the extra, and I also
Hashtag outwork.
Right. I mean, in a way, yes. And I had no sense that if I do this, then I can't progress next week, and so on. And certainly I vary things like exercise order frequently. I've been doing that a lot recently, just as a means of making workouts more efficient if I can't get to this, and so on. But yeah, there does need to be a minimum threshold. That's hard to quantify. 74% of sets you perform need to be the same. But yeah, it needs to be deliberate. You need to, I am
Yeah.
doing this because of this, and I am aware that this might be an expense of that, and that makes sense. That is very different to,
Arbitrary
um,
changes. Yeah.
yeah, like I did barbell last week and I did dumbbell this week because it's different.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. There needs to be justification for the auto-regulation in itself. And I guess one of the things that I wanted to discuss today in terms of periodization for bodybuilders is that we know that periodization and planning training is with the intention of maximizing outcomes at certain time points. And there's some research by Pompa and others that distinguishes between two separate phases of training, being the preparatory phase and then the competition phase. And I guess if we bring this to the context of bodybuilding, it's off-season and contest prep. So do you want to talk about how bodybuilders can plan their training for these two different phases and some considerations for what we've spoken about in terms of the concepts within periodization for off-season versus contest prep?
I think all of the fundamentals would remain the same.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, practical application would remain the same, keeping in mind that practical application should be flexible. So what you actually do in terms of volume especially might be different, although I also don't want to say, hey, okay, you're cutting, reduce your volume by 30%.
Yeah.
Because that's a nice way to worsen outcomes. But yes, I think there are different levels or ways in which to think about this, and I really think that the fundamentals of you should try to get a handle on how much you can do. I wouldn't operate right at your limits, but pretty close. Aim to progress consistently but modestly. Very exercise selection throughout a training week. Very, loads largely depending on exercise. All of those things I would apply in both of those contexts. It's just that what happens will be different, but how you respond to it fundamentally should be the same. Okay, so you're much leaner, you are eating less, you're not able to perform in the same way, so you make adjustments. But if that were true in the off season, and I realize how weird a hypothetical that is, if you were starving in the off season, what are you talking about? But what I'm saying is, if you were to take that context out of that context and put it over here, the training philosophy is the same.
Yeah.
So you would respond to it in the same way, as opposed to, off season, you train as heavy as possible. Contest prep, you go for the cuts, where it's just it's different planets.
Yeah. And I think that's something that I have noticed in the bodybuilding community becoming more and more apparent. People aren't going from, I train heavy in the off season, eat a shit ton of food, and then, I'm cutting high reps, dieting, calorie deficit. There's much more carryover now, but I guess the key thing that bodybuilders need to recognize is that the definition of periodization is manipulation of training variables to maximize outcomes. The outcomes that we get in the contest prep when we're enduring semi-starvation are very different, but we apply the same manipulation of those variables.
Yeah, I think to your earlier point, I honestly, my sense is that a lot of supposed stereotypical bro concepts are pretty much dead. I mean, getting off topic here, but the controversy surrounding flexible dieting. But when you really kind of look at what IFBB pros do, Jay Cutler eats in and out in the off, or when he was competing, he ate that in the off season, and so there was kind of more gray area than a lot of people probably thought. And yeah, with the training, I almost don't see that happening at all anymore. But yes, I do think that I said this before. I think I was talking about, I took things that I learned from cutting and applied them to bulking, eating a lot more and so on. But hey, if I find that I really actually kind of thrive with something like a meal plan, then I can still do that. Similarly, if you find let's say someone has a relatively low volume tolerance. They will figure that out in the off season, even when they're eating a ton of food, because it isn't like you don't respond well to high volume, but if you just eat 5,000 calories, you'll respond amazingly to high volume. That makes a difference. Your food intake makes a difference, but there's, some component of that is inherent, and you can't just throw more food at it and suddenly have the recovery capacity of Ronnie Coleman. So that would be something, I've really learned that this year in terms of how I can recover. And so, I'm going to apply that. I will at least try to apply that to everything moving forward.
Definitely. And I guess the last thing that, I wanted to talk about when it comes to periodization, which was something you touched on at the very start of our discussion on this, was variation, and that being different to planning. So obviously, to sort of recap what we've established today is that, daily undulating periodization will tick most of the boxes for hypertrophy training. We need to have progressively overloaded schemes in place that are somewhat conservative, so that we don't need this big up and down, work to rest ratio. And, we auto-regulate our training to make sure that we can appropriately progress over a longer period, as opposed to, like I mentioned, having to drop volume and intensity because we've overreached. So when does variation come into this? Considering that for bodybuilders, for the most part, once you have that microcycle set up and you establish those baselines, it is quite simply a matter of, modest progressions. Like, when does variation become necessary?
I really try to build it in. So there's variation on the level of variation within a training week or a microcycle, and then varying exercises from a macrocycle to another, which I do to some extent. But the big, someone asked a question about this to Brett Contreras, and he said something like you could change exercises every 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. I think 4 is more common for him, but his biggest reason was people get bored, people want to do things differently, which is totally legitimate. If someone just wants to do something different, I get it. But from a physiological perspective, I'm more kind of figure out what works and stick to that. I like probably more variation than what a lot of people recommend within a training week or microcycle, for at least 2 reasons. One is really kind of complete hypertrophy. As an example, ensuring you're getting sufficient stimulus for both the sternal and clavicular heads of your pec.
Yeah.
And, addressing all the different functions of the different, not necessarily all, but a variety of functions of the muscles of the back, and so on. Also, and I didn't think about this as much until recently, but I think it's a really good point. Varying exercises as a means of decreasing injury risk. So definitely. Let's say, training your chest, instead of just hammering just over and over and over again the same movement pattern, which entails the wear and tear of that movement pattern, doing different movement patterns to stimulate the same muscle. And which, interestingly, by the way, works really well for strength. But I think it helps with injury prevention. But then over longer periods, it's so much more to do with, hey, do you want to, if someone, I'm just really bored of this, or just doesn't feel good anymore. Mm-hmm. As non nail downable, like, what does that even, it happens. You'll do an exercise for 8 weeks and then it just starts feeling terrible. So do something else.
Definitely. It very much, in a practical sense, is all about consistency over time, because we know that we need to increase volume over time. And if somebody can't follow something because they're getting bored, or they're developing overuse injuries and things like this, maximizing hypertrophy is not going to happen. It's as simple as that.
Agreed.
And do you want to quickly summarize what we've gone through today, nuts and bolts of periodization for bodybuilders?
Yeah, I would start with understanding that the most important variable, really the most important variable, is going to be volume. Secondarily, still significant, training frequency, ensure those are addressed. And then, and again, this is my perspective. Mm-hmm. I would suggest designing things in a way that they are sustainable without large changes intended to accommodate an accumulation of fatigue resulting from exceeding what you're able to recover from in the long term. So certainly I like structured variation in terms of variation in exercise selection. Probably doesn't meet really any definition of periodization. That would. I'm actually not sure what I think about that one. I haven't typically seen it, included in that category. But within a training week, I like variation in terms of exercise selection for the reasons that I just outlined.
Mm-hmm.
I like variation in load, really rep ranges to address, all. Part of it is ensuring that you get enough overall volume, which you had mentioned earlier. Another aspect of it is ensuring that, if there are inherent benefits to different rep ranges, you get all of those. I would also add that I think different exercises are best trained at different rep ranges. This is something that we haven't gotten into here, but and indeed, it would take too long to properly outline that. But again, I think different exercises of different types are best trained at different rep ranges, and then you can account for that within a training week by putting different exercises in different slots with different rep ranges, which then by default addresses, okay, if there are benefits to different rep ranges, you've done that. And then laying that out in a week so that you're getting the volume you want, you're getting the frequency that you want, but you're able to recover from it both day by day, although I'm willing to budge a little bit more on that because I think it would be so high a standard to say you need to feel amazing after every workout and in the morning following every workout. But I do aim for folks to be ready for the next training week at the end of a training week and be proactive about recognizing when someone is fatigued, when they're getting more fatigued, when workouts are indeed, you want to catch this before performance even starts degrading, but certainly when it does, you want to make adjustments at that point, which gets into the autoregulatory component, which is, certainly design a plan which you believe to be ideal, but continuously monitor it, see how things are going. Are you progressing? How are you feeling? And what I often say is, not that I want to approach things from a negative perspective, but oftentimes the question to ask is, what's wrong or how is it not working? Because if something is working well, you don't need to change it unless there's some way that you could make it even better. But typically, if it isn't broken, you don't need to fix it. And so I do find that the more practical question is, how is it not working? And then on that basis, you make adjustments. And then you're able to make adjustments both on in this workout, I'm changing it. I'm changing something I'm doing later in the week. But then all of that cumulatively tells you what you're able to do in the long term. And then eventually you get to a point where, for the most part, everything just flows naturally.
Awesome.
Except when life happens and then you have to improvise.
Yeah, that's the tricky part for sure. Ian, thank you very much for your time, guys. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Muscle by Brain. Make sure you like the video, comment if you have any questions or comments, and we'll speak to you all next time. Thanks, Ian.
Thank you.